Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Derek here. Today we're going to be looking at one of the two practice quizzes for the AZ-900. Both of these are going to be available at the link in the description below if you're seeing this on YouTube. So if you're interested, definitely check that out. As this kind of says here, you can sign in if you would like to save your progress and come back to it. But of course, I recommend just going through it right away, all in one go, so you could imitate what this would actually be like when you're taking the real test, okay? Not the most difficult test, but you still want to be prepared. So let's go ahead and go through this. And then, as always, at the end, once we submit our responses, you're going to get links to documentation, right or wrong answer, as well as an explanation on why it was right or wrong, okay? So let's go ahead and get into it here. All right. Question number one. So, which two Azure services are ideal for hosting a website that experiences variable traffic? Okay. So, Azure App Service is definitely one because its whole purpose is to host applications. And blob storage is probably not going to be it here because that's just, sort of unstructured storage, not really for website hosting. Azure Virtual Machines, it could be. It's not really, designed to host websites specifically. But I would say it's more plausible to use this for hosting a website than Azure Functions. Functions are just sort of a service that's used for like serverless computing and tasks. Not really for like website hosting. So I'm gonna go with Azure VMs. Even though this isn't perfect, it'll do. Okay. All right. So a business is planning to migrate to the cloud to improve its scalability and reduce costs. However, they want to maintain some workloads on-prem due to regulatory requirements. Which cloud deployment model is most suitable? All right, so right away you should be thinking, all right, well, we are going to have some resources in the cloud because we're migrating to the cloud, but we're also going to have some workloads, some resources on-prem. That's the definition of a hybrid cloud. All right, so we're going to go with that. Pretty easy there, pretty straightforward once you know the cloud deployment models. All right. A company needs to track operational costs and optimize spending across multiple Azure services. Which Azure service should they use? All right, so they need to track costs and optimize spending. Well, right away, those are the kind of the keywords there, right? Track costs and optimize spending. So we can rule out Security Center. That's not designed, specifically for tracking costs and optimizing spending. Neither is Service Health, neither is Monitor. As you might have guessed by the name, cost management and billing, I believe, is going to be the correct answer here. All right. Which deployment model is best for a company needing both on-prem control for sensitive processes and cloud benefits for variable workloads? Well, we kind of just got this question, didn't we? Right? It's pretty similar here. Lucky for us, it was kind of back to back almost. So, yeah, this looks like a hybrid cloud, right? We have some resources uh, on-prem, and then we also have some resources in the cloud. Okay. All right. Which two features are provided by Azure Monitor? So, application performance monitoring. That definitely sounds about right. Automated resource deployment. Not sure about this one. That sounds more like Azure Resource Manager and ARM templates. Network performance monitoring. That sounds about right. And then database management. That's not necessary. Again, we're monitoring, not managing. So I'm going to rule that one out. So I'm going to go with these two. It kind of helps that they have monitoring in the name. So there you go. Those should be the correct ones. All right. Which of the following is a characteristic of public cloud computing? All right. Let's see. So dedicated hardware for each customer, community access to resources, resources shared among multiple customers, or on-prem resource hosting. All right. So we know it's not on-prem resource hosting because it's not public if it's on your local business premises. So we can for sure rule that one out. Dedicated hardware for each customer, we can definitely rule that one out too, because when you're using a public cloud, you don't necessarily get dedicated hardware unless you specify that. Okay, that's not like something that's innate to the public cloud computing model. Community access to resources. This isn't really the definition of public cloud computing. It's kind of confusing, but essentially, with public cloud computing, the key premise here is that you're sharing resources with other customers, right? That's, when we think about economy of scale and, uh, the kind of shared responsibility, that all comes from all of these resources, the physical resources that Azure is hosting and maintaining, being shared with multiple customers, okay? So I'm going to go with that one. What is the primary function of Azure Blueprints? All right. Performance monitoring, that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily a monitoring tool. Okay. Automated resource deployment, that could definitely be a valid option here. Network configuration, I don't believe that Blueprints does that. And then compliance auditing. Compliance is a different service, definitely not Blueprints, so we can rule out that one and that one for sure. So I'm pretty sure we're going to go with automated resource deployment, right? When you think about a blueprint, it's a blueprint on how you want to build something, right? So that makes sense to me. All right. Which two features are provided by Azure Monitor? Pretty similar question here. These questions seem to be very conveniently shuffled for us this time around, so that makes it nice. But again, application and network performance monitoring are definitely some features of Azure Monitor, okay? So even though we've gotten this a few times, definitely want to remember that. You'll be asked about Monitor probably multiple times in multiple ways on the test itself, so get familiar with that service, all right? Which Azure service is used for relational database management? Okay, so Cosmos DB is actually for NoSQL databases, so we can rule that one out. Blob storage is sort of unstructured storage, very flexible object storage, definitely not specifically used for relational database management. SQL database, so this definitely makes sense because SQL databases, by definition, are relational databases. So that looks good. And then table storage. So table storage is kind of confusing because it's actually a NoSQL based storage, if I remember right. But when you think about tables, they typically, live in SQL databases. That's what they're referred to as a table. So that's one of the things, amongst other things, that Azure does that I think is very confusing, but it is what it is. But relational database management is for sure a SQL database. Okay. All right, so which two Azure services are ideal for building and deploying microservices? Okay, so microservices, remember, are something that basically they serve a very specific purpose. They're not meant to host, an entire application or anything of that nature. They're meant for just, very small kind of chunks of what your application needs to work, as opposed to like the larger, broader pieces. Okay. All right, so Azure Kubernetes service is what you would use to orchestrate containers. Not sure that would be applicable here, but let's keep looking. Azure Virtual Network, that's definitely not used for microservices. SQL Database, not used for microservices either. So functions, we can say that. And I suppose Kubernetes, we could say that because if you have the containers themselves that are, used for microservices amongst other things, you could organize those for AKS. So this one could be indirectly correct, much more so than virtual networks or SQL databases. All right, so we'll go with those. Which of the following is a primary benefit of using cloud computing? So unlimited physical security, unlimited is a strong word. On-premise data control. So the whole purpose of cloud is not having things on-premise, so we can definitely rule that one out. Scalability on demand. That totally makes sense. Fixed capacity. Nope. That's actually the exact opposite of what you get with cloud computing, right? So I'm going to go with scalability on demand. That totally makes sense out of all those. Unlimited physical security. I mean, unlimited is a hard thing to say. Even though Azure does a great job of providing physical security, it's not foolproof, it's not perfect. So I can't really say that unlimited sounds good there, okay? All right, a healthcare organization needs to store patient records while complying with regulatory standards. Which cloud deployment model should they use? Okay, so they basically it sounds like they don't want to be sharing infrastructure, so we're gonna rule out public. Multi-cloud could also have piece components of public. That's kind of a broad term, so we can rule that out. And then hybrid, again, also that means some private, some public, so we can rule that out. I'm gonna go with private. Okay. All right, and that's a nice question actually, because you could see that public, hybrid, and multi-cloud are all, they all have components of public, which leaves private on its own. So you could kind of say that one doesn't belong, so that one's likely the answer. Okay. A company needs to store large amounts of unstructured data for future analysis. Which Azure storage solution should they use? Okay, so large amounts of unstructured data. So unstructured data is kind of the key word here. SQL databases need to be quite structured, so we'll rule that out. In fact, it stands for structured query language. We could definitely rule that one out. Blob storage is definitely designed for just various types of data, unstructured. It doesn't really have to mean anything. It could be files, could be videos, could be tables, could be whatever. So that sounds good. Table storage is actually, again, for more like SQL specific or NoSQL specific storage. And then queue storage is sort of a way to hold messages between your components so your applications can communicate and work with each other. But it's not really for unstructured data. So I'm going to go with blob storage there. That's actually what blob storage is kind of sold as, is for large unstructured data. Okay. Which Azure tool is used for automating deployment and management of resources? So Monitor, we already saw that a few times. That's used for application and network monitoring. Azure Automation, that could be it. Azure Logic Apps, this is something that's, kind of sets up workflows, if I remember right. It's not specifically for automating deployment and management of resources. Azure Resource Manager, though, is definitely something that is specifically meant for automating deployment and management of resources. So Azure Automation, if I remember right, is more suited for sort of automating repetitive tasks as opposed to managing your resources. So while you could perhaps use automation to automate your deployment of your resources, you can't necessarily use it to manage them and then keep them updated and apply changes and track those changes. Okay, all that would be better suited for Azure Resource Manager, right? You could use things like ARM templates, for example. Okay. Which of the following are benefits of using a hybrid cloud model? Okay, so remember, hybrid is partially public, partially private. Okay. So capital expense reduction. It's possible. I guess it depends on how much you go, public cloud, because you have private cloud, you're still going to have on-premise servers and resources you have to pay for via capital expenses. Enhanced data security, that could definitely be a valid option because you can store maybe more sensitive things on your on-prem cloud. Okay. Operational agility, that could also make sense because you can scale things very quickly in the public cloud segment of your hybrid cloud if you need to. And then complete reliance on public cloud, that's definitely not correct because, again, it's hybrid is partially public, partially private. So I'm actually going to select these two. This one I'm not sure about because, again, it depends on how much you have on-prem. You could potentially not really reduce these as much. And this isn't necessarily something that's seen as a benefit of a hybrid cloud model, okay? If you want capital expense reduction, you should just go for public cloud, okay? Which Azure service is primarily used for hosting web applications? All right, so VMs, again, you maybe could, but it's not best suited for hosting applications. Azure App Service is actually specifically designed to host web applications, so I'm going to pick that one. Blob storage, again, that's that unstructured data storage, and then functions is a sort of serverless compute service to run functions and run code and uh, basically react to events. Okay, so we're going to go with app service here. What is the primary purpose of Azure Policy? All right, performance monitoring. Nope, that's going to be monitor. Compliance enforcement. That definitely sounds right. That's actually specifically what policy is for. Data analytics, not so much. I mean, analytics and policy definitely don't really, mesh together. And the network configuration, also not, part of policy, right? It can't actually configure things for you. It just tracks if things are compliant, and then you can be notified on if they are not. Okay. Which two characteristics are inherent to public cloud computing? Dedicated hardware, definitely not. Resource pooling, that's possible because you're sharing resources with other customers, like we talked about earlier. Limited elasticity, that's definitely not a characteristic. In fact, it's the opposite. When you do public cloud computing, you're leveraging the fact that you can have basically as many resources as you need, and then you could get rid of them immediately too if you're not actually using them, which is the definition of elasticity. And then broad network access, that definitely makes sense because you can set up resources anywhere. So I'm going to select B and D there. Okay. Which Azure service is used for highly scalable NoSQL databases? Okay, well, we already kind of talked about Cosmos DB being the primary NoSQL database offering from Azure, so that's looking good. SQL database is not used for NoSQL, it's used for SQL. Blob storage is unstructured data, and then table storage is technically it is used for NoSQL type storage. However, Cosmos DB is going to be much more scalable. So I'm going to go with Cosmos DB because, again, that to me is the better of two answers. Okay. All right. So, which two services are part of Azure's infrastructure as a service offerings? Okay. Azure VMs, definitely one of them there. Azure Functions. Um, I'm going to say no because Azure Functions is serverless, so there's not really any infrastructure that you're being provided with. Azure Blob Storage, same thing. You're not really, provisioning any sort of infrastructure. Virtual network, though, that makes more sense than functions of blob storage because with the, when you're doing a VNet, you're provisioning things like routers and switches, actual kind of infrastructure that you need to have your resources be able to talk to each other and communicate. Okay, so I'm going to go with A and D there. Which two Azure services are essential for maintaining security and compliance in your Azure environment? All right, well, we already looked at one. So compliance, again, when we think compliance, we want to think of policy. So I'm going to go ahead and select that one. And then maintaining security, I mean, the one that makes the most sense is obviously Security Center. Logic apps and app service, while using them properly, can um, contribute to a higher level of security and compliance. They're not specifically designed for either of those. Okay, so I'm going to go with those two. What is a key benefit of cloud computing over traditional data centers? So, cloud computing over traditional data centers. So, higher initial capital expenditure, that's the opposite. Okay, with cloud computing, you're going to have lower capex. Fixed scalability, again, with cloud computing, we don't have fixed scalability. Oops, we don't want that. On-demand scalability, that sounds better. And then longer deployment times, that's also incorrect because you can deploy resources whenever, wherever. There's a little bit of delay, but it's exponentially faster than, setting up new servers in a data center and doing all that. Okay. All right, which Azure service provides detailed cost and usage reporting to help manage and optimize spending? All right, so we had a pretty similar question to this earlier. Again, you just want to know what the main service for Azure is in regards to managing your costs and your spending. And for us, that's going to be cost management and billing. Okay. You could argue that Advisor is part of this umbrella because one of the categories that it advises you on does relate to cost, but again, if we're looking for specific detailed cost and usage reporting, we're going to want cost management and billing. Okay. Which two Azure services are categorized under Azure Storage? All right. Well, we know for a fact that blob storage is one of them. We talked about that a few times. Functions is not the serverless compute service. Okay, that's not storage, that's compute. Table storage, that sounds about right. And then Cosmos DB is a database as opposed to a storage. Okay, there's kind of a fine difference there. If you want to know more about what that is, or the difference between the two rather, then check out the study guide video. Okay. All right, which services are part of Azure networking? Azure Virtual Network, that's the key component of it there. Cosmos DB, like we just said, is database, not necessarily networking. And then blob storage is going to be storage, again, not networking. So ExpressRoute is definitely a part of networking. That's how you basically have a direct physical connection to your Azure cloud from your on-premise resources, okay? Or data centers, whatever. All right. Select two components of Azure governance. Okay, well, we know policy is one of them. Functions, again, serverless compute, probably not really having anything to do with governance. Blob storage is just storage. Blueprints, though, you can, specify how you want your resources deployed, who's allowed to do things, who's allowed to make changes, who's allowed to view things once they're deployed. So blueprints definitely could contribute to that, much more so than functions and blob storage, okay? Remember, guys, on these tests, you want to select the best possible answers, okay? There's some that might be right, but there's definitely going to be some that are more correct, okay? A company wants to expand its data storage capabilities without investing in physical hardware, okay? Which cloud service model should they consider? All right, so the key component here of this question is they do not want to invest in physical hardware. But if you want to store data, you need physical hardware. So if this is the case, it makes sense to me that you would want infrastructure as a service. Okay. An organization wants to automate the deployment of Azure resources and consistently manage them across multiple subscriptions. Which Azure service should they use? Okay. So automate the deployment of resources and manage them. So automation and management. All right. We talked about this earlier. Automation, you can't really get that management component. Resource manager, you can definitely get both of those. DevOps, that's more for kind of pipelines and deployments. Again, it's not really for specifically for automating deployments, and then managing them across multiple subscriptions is another keyword there. Right? And the logic apps, again, this has to do with workflows, not necessarily with what we're looking for here. Right? Which of the following are fundamental characteristics of cloud computing? All right, on-prem resources, definitely not that one. High latency, definitely not that one, right? The whole point of this is that you don't need your own resources, and you can set up your resources in the cloud close to your customers so that they have lower latency. All right, so because those two are obviously not correct, we can definitely select these, which they make sense anyways. Okay. Which Azure service is used for relational database management? Well, again, Cosmos DB, NoSQL, blob storage, unsqled, SQL database, relational databases, and then table storage is not specifically relational database management. Okay? Again, it's storage, it's not really database, and SQL database is specifically for SQL databases, relational databases. Okay? What is Azure Compute for? And which service falls in the domain of computing? So Azure Compute is not for data analytics, so we can go ahead and rule that out, although Azure VMs definitely fall in the domain of Azure Compute. Azure Compute is not for networking, Azure Compute is definitely for processing power for running applications. And yes, indeed, functions are a part of compute. So I'm going to select that one, but let's look at this last one. So Azure Compute is not, again, for data storage. Okay, so that one definitely makes sense. We're going to go with that one here. All right. All right. Which Azure service should be used to manage access and permissions for users and groups across Azure services? All right. So managing access and permissions for users and groups. Hmm. All right. So Azure policy is more for compliance, not really managing access. Monitor is again for performance monitoring, and then service health. Basically, what that does is it lets you know if there's an issue with some sort of Azure service that could affect your resources. So it's not that one. So because of that, we can go ahead and select this first one, which by the way, this used to be called Azure Active Directory, but now it's Microsoft Entra ID, just so you're aware there. Um, and okay, moving on. So a company wants to ensure that all of its Azure resources comply, keyword there, with corporate policies. Which Azure service should they use to enforce and audit these policies? Okay. Azure policy, like we've already said, and committed to Azure policy. That's for compliance rather. Right? These three are not necessarily for compliance. You could, maybe think of security as being a way to contribute to your compliance, but again, it's not specifically for measuring compliance across your organization and corporate policies. Okay? A media company needs to store and stream large video files to their users. Which Azure service should they use? All right, so store and stream large video files. So blob storage kind of makes sense because you can store, again, unstructured data, which could be anything, including large video files. So that's got potential. Azure File Storage is not necessarily going to be the best bet here. That's more for, think of like file, your File Explorer, right? Your files and folders. That's what that's more for, right? SQL databases, relational databases, definitely are not meant to hold large video files. And then table storage, same thing, not meant to hold large video files. So we're going to go with blob storage. Which two Azure services are essential for disaster recovery planning? Okay, we've got Azure Site Recovery, which totally makes sense. Blob storage could be considered here, but it doesn't necessarily help you recover because what if you have, resources other, stored in other types of storage or in other databases, right? That then your blob storage isn't going to help you there. All right, so again, that could be the answer, but again, I don't think it's one of the best answers. Traffic Manager is definitely not something that's going to be used for disaster recovery. That's more for sort of routing your application and your traffic. Backup, though, will definitely help you because it'll back up, your data. It'll back up sort of the state of things and allow you to restore if something does happen. Okay, so I'm gonna go with those two, A and D. All right. Okay, a company wants to ensure uh, consistent configuration and compliance across their Azure environment. Which Azure service should they use? All right, guys. So again, pay attention to the keywords. Compliance. All right. We're gonna go with policy because again, that is specifically for compliance. All right. Monitor is for monitoring, automation, doesn't have to do with compliance. And advisor, again, isn't specifically for compliance. It also includes other things that aren't really related to, compliance itself. Okay. So some of these things may help with configuration, but we need configuration and compliance, right? So remember to read the questions carefully. All right. A company is considering migrating to the cloud to handle unpredictable traffic spikes on their e-commerce website. Which two cloud computing features are most beneficial for this scenario? Okay, so they want to migrate to the cloud. So which two features are beneficial for migrating to the cloud, right? So when you migrate to the cloud, you definitely have elasticity, especially if you have unpredictable traffic spikes. So we're going to select that one. On-prem data control, that's, migrating away from the cloud or migrating to the cloud, so we can get rid of that one. Pay-as-you-go pricing, that definitely makes sense because, you can pay just as you use your resources and then get rid of them once you don't need them and you're not paying for them anymore. And then custom hardware, not really the case here because, you kind of get what Azure has. Uh, excuse me. Custom hardware, you kind of just get what Azure has, even though you can do things like, reservations to allow you to maybe configure your hardware. It's not necessarily customized, especially when we think about like just cloud computing in general. Okay, so a developer needs to deploy a web application, excuse me, that will automatically scale based on user demand. Which services should they use? Hmm. So I can roll out functions right away. That's not used for web applications. Azure App Service, definitely, again, if we think about, web apps, you should always at least be considering app service to a degree, okay? And then VMs, again, not necessarily the best for hosting applications. Kubernetes service, however, you can orchestrate your containers, which contain everything your applications need to run, except for the operating system, of course. Okay, so I'm gonna go with those two. Which of the following best describes the use for Azure policy? Again, compliance and governance. Compliance, compliance, compliance. You've gotten like 3, 4 questions about Azure policy. There's a reason. It's going to come up on the test. So you need to know what it is. All right. A company wants to analyze large volumes of data using big data analytics. Which combination is most appropriate for this task? Okay, this is an interesting one. All right, so big data analytics, so Cosmos DB and Azure Functions, that's we're gonna rule that out because neither of those are specifically for big data analytics. HD Insight and Azure Data Lake Storage, that sounds pretty good. I'm gonna select that one for now. SQL Database and Azure App Service, again, not for data analytics. Blob Storage and Azure VMs, not for data analytics, all right? So this is kind of a nice question too, because even though we haven't really talked much about HD Insight and Data Lake Storage, because we have talked a lot about these other services, you can really kind of infer that they're not necessarily used for data analytics, which only leaves one remaining answer, which to me, I believe is the right answer. All right. So that's it. Let's submit and see how we did here. So once we submit, we're just going to go to view score. And okay, so it looks like we did miss one. Okay, so it is Azure Functions instead of VMs. So let's see. So Azure App Service and Functions are ideal for hosting websites due to their scalability and service computing. So VMs offer less flexibility and auto scaling compared to these services. And blob storage is primarily for unstructured data storage. Interesting. So since I got this wrong, if I was preparing to take the test and I wanted to do some more research, which I would recommend, especially on questions you maybe don't get correct, uh, I would go to maybe well, definitely both of or all of the documentation here, but for sure the one about, the service that I missed here. So I would go to the functions FAQ. And we could scroll through here and see that, okay, hosting website that experiences variable traffic. So, okay, so it does serverless application development. I guess we can use it for that. So if we maybe go to the FAQs, Microsoft doesn't really have the best FAQs, but let's see what they got. So yeah, so Azure Container Apps. So I guess you can use Azure App Service Plan. Okay, so yeah, that makes sense then. You can definitely use functions here. All right, so that would make sense. And then again, I would just realize and keep in the back of my mind that, okay, I guess you can use functions to help you host a website, right? And maybe not by itself, but in conjunction with Azure App Service, again, in the context of this question, that could definitely be correct, all right? All right, and you can see here, even if you get the correct answer, you'll still get your explanation and links to documentation so you can follow up and really drill down these concepts. But we're not going to spend too much time going through these because it looks like we got all these. I don't see any red. Nice. So we only missed one, so I would say this is definitely a passing score. All right. So hopefully that's helpful. Again, if you would like to have both of these practice quizzes, then they are going to be available at the link in the description. But again, this isn't a super hard test, so I wouldn't say you need more than like, 2 or 3 practice tests along with the study guide we have available both in the video, and if you like the actual PowerPoint, that's available with the study guide that's also linked in the description, okay? So again, hope this is helpful. If you're getting ready to take your test, best of luck, and we will see you next time.